Good morning, everyone. It is good to see you all. I am ready to begin class again with my trusty compatriots, Johnny Rosenhauer and Paul Reed. We're going to be discussing Titus chapter 3, verses 1 and 2 today. It's a very narrow scripture, but it's still full of really good things. And it's things I want to talk about in a little more detail because it's repeating concepts that we've seen in chapters 1 and 2 as to what type of life Christians are supposed to lead. Before we go too far down that road, I do want to share with y'all, today has been a rough day for me. I've had a headache all day. I got the gout in my big toe, which is excruciating. And then I found out that I tore a meniscus in my knee, and it hurts a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit, and I'm not moving around real fast. Fortunately, my tongue was not sprained, so I should be able to function in the capacity I've been brought here to do today. So I wouldn't worry about it too much. But I did want to let you know if I seem a little off my game, that's probably what it's related to. The other thing is, and this is something that I don't like about Zoom, because I sit real close to the thing and I see myself the whole time. It's like a mirror. And I'm struggling. I don't know if it's the masks or it's stress or what, but my face is broke out like crazy. So you'll have to excuse how my nose has all these red splotches all over it. I can't do anything about it. I swear to you, I wash my face every day, multiple times, because I'm very sensitive about my blemishes. It's one of my vanities. But that being said, I can't do anything about it. So y'all will just have to live with my minor imperfections that exist in my visage here. Okay. Well, let's get into Titus chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. Johnny, if you don't mind, could you read that for us?
Yes, sir. Titus 3, verses 1 and 2. Remind them to be subject to rulers and authorities, to obey, to be ready for every good work, to speak evil of no one, to be peaceable, gentle, showing all humility to all men.
Okay. Relatively short 2 verses. I think it's interesting to notice it starts off with the imperative to remind the people. So what does that immediately tell us? Titus is to remind the people. That means what about the people?
Probably means that they need to be reminded, like we all do, to reinforce, because you can say the same thing in a variety of ways, and each way you say it will impact differently, and folks will hear it in a different way. And sometimes you gotta say it more than once, sir.
Well, when you say remind, it immediately means they've already heard the message.
Sure.
They've already heard it before. You know, I get the impression that when Paul came to Crete, he probably shared that message with them. This is how you're supposed to behave. This is how you're supposed to act. You know, every commentator I read about Titus, all they talk about, and it's in chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, is how ill-behaved the Cretans are. I mean, they you know, because of that one verse that's in there, and I'm sure the history books support that position. But man, if you're a sensitive Cretan, it's easy to be embarrassed by how often people think you need to be reminded to behave a certain way. You know, unfortunately, when I look at us today and how we interact with each other in the world today, even within the church, I can't help but feel we as a people need to be reminded how to behave in regards to these things.
Don't you also reckon that what he's saying here is not fancy, eloquent words, but saying your actions speak louder than your words? So show the people what I'm asking you to demonstrate.
Yeah, and that's a point that comes up throughout this is you really know people by their actions. It's not sufficient to spout platitudes and virtues and proverbs. You know, you know how a person is by the way they act, right? Paul, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, well, you asked about remind, to me, it's a decision. Every day you have to make a decision how you're going to handle things throughout the day, actually. And so, remind is to me is a good word because you have to make a decision about how you're going to do things. But the other thing is about habits. It takes a whole lot of repetition to make a habit to create a new habit, or to break an old one, or to create a new one.
Right.
And you're an attorney, and so what do you call your business? Is it a law shop or a law what?
Firm.
Is it also called a law practice?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Medical practice. You're practicing the arts all the time. Dr. Hyman is practicing his art all the time. It's you're practicing it. You get better. To me, practice says that you're trying not to keep doing the same thing over and over again, because that's insanity, but to try to get better at it every time you do it, because that's that practice makes perfect. That means you have to practice perfectly. And so it's just to me, it's a reminder about making choices, and hey, I'm gonna try to do better tomorrow than I did today. And that's not easy to do. It's easy to fall back into your old self.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a big proponent of the idea that we have to live intentionally. We have to wake up and say to ourselves, today, I'm going to be X, and it's in that intention that we become our best selves. It's not something that happens accidentally. It is something that we have to set our minds towards and let our behaviors model. I wanted to bring up that, a lot of the things that Johnny just read sounds like things we would teach to our children. Obey your teachers, be nice to your neighbors, try to do what is good, don't start fights. And so sometimes I think we see these behaviors as elementary, but I do believe that in our society, as we've evolved, especially with things like social media, the way we interact with each other, often through our screens, through texting, emails, different things like that, I think our relationships have become more distant with each other. And some of these behaviors have fallen by the wayside. Some of these positive, virtuous behaviors start to fall by the wayside. Anybody that spends any time on Facebook can see people saying things to each other that they would never say if they were sitting across the table from each other eating dinner. And I think we as Christians need to be conscious that whatever forum we're in, whatever milieu we are using in our conversation, that we still need to model these behaviors. And I would just remind you that whether it's through Facebook or Twitter or face-to-face or a telephone call, these behaviors, no matter how elementary, are supposed to be foundational to how we behave as Christians. So keep that in mind as we go through these things.
So I'd like to comment that now I took English. I like English 1 so much, I took it 3 times before they let me get out of it. But these are pretty simplistic action verbs: to be, to do. He didn't make it eloquent. He just spoke very simplistically and said, these are action words. These are actions that I'd like for you to model. Here's your checklist. And so he didn't elaborate, expand. He just said, here you go. Pretty succinct and pretty accurate, I think.
Yeah, it's not one of those areas that you have to overcomplicate. Okay, starting off with this first one: to be subject to rulers and authorities. Now, I think it's interesting here because we live in a very political time. And it's kind of funny. I hear people say things like, he's not my president, or he's not my senator or my congressperson, or whatever the case may be. I think we need to keep in mind that when Paul wrote this to Titus, the government at that time was most likely Nero. We're not talking about a good government. We're talking about a bad government, and probably a government. Well, we can just look at Paul's life. How many times did city officials treat him poorly, imprison him, lead to him doing things that took away his freedoms in a lot of cases? I find it interesting that even in spite of the poor government that he saw around him, there is this call to be subject to rulers and authorities. And the word is subject, which is submit in the original Greek. That's usually how it's stated. Paul?
Yeah, Jason, this, what you talk about, we live in a political time. The world has always been this way. There's no real difference from the last 8,500 years. It's the same stuff. It's just different technology, but it's the same stuff. People are people. I think having a good ruler is quite rare. Having rulers you don't like is pretty normal. And so I don't think it's any different in Paul's time. If you look at Nero's predecessors, they weren't very nice people either, and all of his successors, they're even worse than Nero. And so and look at the rulers of the Jews, Herod and all of his four progeny. They're not nice people. The guy that was before Herod, the one the Maccabees rebelled against, what is it? Whatever his name was, the fourth, Epiphanes the fourth. That guy was the one that slaughtered a pig in the temple and made himself God. And he slaughtered people. He was not a good guy. And that was just before all of this. And so, it's nothing new. What we think, what we see on TV is horrible. Yeah, it is. There's no question about it, but it's nothing new.
And I think the fact that Crete was a real melting pot, there was such a heterogeneous collection of faiths and beliefs and ancestries there that were kind of thrown together, that it was not even close to just like me. It was very, 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 very different. And that couldn't have helped the scenarios that you're talking about, sir.
Yeah, I agree with you, Paul, that it's always been this way on some level. I will say that I think with social media, we see more confrontation. We see more strident comments than we have historically. But that being said, I think as Christians, we need to try to concentrate and try to cultivate a passion for serving in God's kingdom as juxtaposed to our passion for the political arenas. Yeah. I see people that every post on Facebook is political. And, sometimes, I'll use my mom as an example. My mom posts Christian stuff on Facebook all the time, almost exclusively. And some of it I find sappy and sentimental. But there is so much more positive, so much more God-oriented in that approach than there is constantly being focused on the political realm. And I have decided, I grew up very political. I formed the Young Republicans Club in my school. I was very strident in my support of politicians, but I reached a point in my life where I decided that my focus was going to be on God's kingdom and not any earthly kingdom. And in making that choice, I started to see these political issues being less important. And I started seeing more of my focus shift towards how can we grow God in our society? You know, how can we grow God in you know, despite the political atmosphere or despite the political arenas? And I really do believe, number one, it's a more comfortable way to live. But number two, I do think that I think it's something in the church we should have as our mindset. I do think God's kingdom comes first over all other things. And there's no second, you know, it's God's kingdom. And I will tell you that if tomorrow the government chose to outlaw us gathering together, it wouldn't change one iota what our obligations are as Christians, what our purpose and drive should be as Christians. We continue to share God's word. We continue to grow the kingdom. We continue to plant the seed that he has given us. And I just think at the end of the day, if that's our mindset, this idea of being submissive to the earthly rulers is something we can appreciate. That's just my thought. Johnny?
I think in the wisdom of this inspired literature that going back to the focus of what was happening here, they were trying to establish and strengthen a relatively new church. And so in order to accomplish that, back to your explanation about the diversity of generations and how different technologies affect, you know, he went through and went line by line, young, old, slave, free, male, female. He did all of that so that he could say, this is applicable to all of us. And now here at this side, he's saying, okay, all together, let's lump together, be these things, to be, to do, to be, to do. So it's magic when you stop and think about the, not magic, but it's just a reminder as a writer to me how blessed we are to have these words from such an intelligent man, inspired by God, because it's applicable today as it was all of those years ago.
And you know, in that vein, I want to take the next subject, which is to be obedient. I think in the context we can say that it appears to me that Paul is telling Titus to remind them to be submissive and obedient to the local authorities and rulers, those people. You know, it's interesting in the obedience and in the submission. You know, Paul submitted to the point that even when he was incarcerated for preaching God's word, he was incarcerated. Now we are familiar with, you know, like the Philippian jailer. We're familiar with situations where crowds gathered against him and he was, you know, able to escape the crowds, different things along those lines. But there is context for this idea that there were multiple times that Paul was obedient and submissive to the local government to the point of losing his own freedom, when I'm sure that there were other avenues available to him. You know, I think it runs counter to our Texas mindset. You know, and I specifically say Texas as opposed to American because, you know, we very much are of the people, come and take it. You know, that's our heritage. That's who we are. And a lot of us are very proud of that, and rightly so. But sometimes being a Christian has a different mindset, lands a different way than it is to be just a citizen of a state or a country. Okay. Any other thoughts before we move on from this government issue?
Remember, even Christ was described as meek and lowly. And so we've got a role model. That kind of runs tough against some of us that think we're better than we are sometimes, but we have the role model to follow not only Paul, but Christ himself.
Yeah, and I think we're going to pick that up here in this second verse here in a second, because you see those ideas put out there over and over again.
Hey,
Paul?
Jason, just to give you an example, this is what Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, beginning with verse 25. Probably verse 20. Yeah, 25. 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I have spent adrift at sea. I have been on frequent journeys and dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from my countrymen, dangers from the Gentiles, dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers at sea, dangers among false brothers. I've been in labor and hardship through many sleepless nights, and hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. Apart from such external things, there is a daily pressure on me of concern for all the churches. Who is weak without my being weak? Who is led into sin without intense concern? And so it just gives you, if you're trying to keep up with what's going on in the book of Acts, which doesn't list all these things. And by the way, when he was stoned, when they walked away, when they quit stoning him, they thought he was dead. Okay? They stoned him till they thought he was dead, if you remember the passage in Acts. So yeah, I think he was obedient to authorities.
And at the same time, he did not stop doing God's will at
Never
the
stopped.
expense of man's
No
law.
matter what happened, he kept doing it. And so that's the message to us. What's more important? Preaching the gospel, telling people about the good news of Jesus Christ, your testimony, or talking about Biden on Facebook,
Right.
or Trump, or whoever you don't like.
Right.
I don't
right.
care who. Take your pick. Or you're sharing, some crazy thing on Facebook. I don't even do social media anymore. Not that I did very much in the first place on Facebook, but I've kind of come to the conclusion it's more important to be all about, the word and teaching the word and living it than that other stuff. It's just not worth it.
Okay. Moving on to the next one, it says to be ready, remind the people to be ready to do whatever is good. Now, I love this because in the first book, in the first reminder, it is to obey, to submit, which is kind of a passive behavior. But here you immediately get to be ready to do whatever is good. This is not passive at all. This is something where they're going to know us by what we do. So be ready always to do what is good. One of my favorite things about Titus is what Johnny pointed out a little bit earlier. When we were in chapter 2, it talked about the old, it talked about men, it talked about women, it talked about the young, it talked about slaves. It said basically, no matter what context you find yourself in, no matter what place you are in this world, you are to be doing good, and you have the potential to do good. No matter if you're the bottom person on the totem pole or you're the top person on the totem pole, you're in a position to do good. So be ready to do it. And that's the very strong message that I see Paul encouraging Titus to share. I want to share a verse real quick. I love the book of Jeremiah. It's a great book. Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 7. This verse has always kind of hit with me because I'm a big believer that no matter where we are, no matter what our situation is, we are always in a situation to do good. And it says this, 29 verse 7 says, also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. These people were getting captured. They're being taken away in captivity. And Jeremiah, God through Jeremiah, is telling them in a letter, pray for the city you're being taken to, because it is where you're supposed to be. And it doing well will be good for you. And it is a call on some level for us to be mindful of doing good in New Braunfels, doing good in our community, doing good, whether we live in Selma, Cibolo, New Braunfels, San Marcos, Canyon Lake, wherever it may be out there doing good, because ultimately it is doing good back unto us. And I also think it furthers God's kingdom. Look, if people see God's people out doing good things, what are they immediately going to think about God? That he's out doing good things. Because I guarantee you, when they see us doing bad things, those things are being marked against us too. One of my favorite examples all the time has to do, because I like to go out and eat. I love to go out and eat. And, when we go out after church, that's one of those times, because lots of times we're dressed a little nicer. It's a very specific time. The wait staff, the people who we're interacting with, they know we're church people. They know we're Christian people. Maybe when we show up on a Thursday night in our flip-flops and shorts and graphic tee, they don't know who we are. But when we show up after church on Sunday and we're dressed nice and we have that look about us, they know who we are. And I have always believed that is one of those times that we act out and really make an impression on people. We either are making a good impression or we're making a bad impression, but we're making an impression every time. So I just can't tell you how important it is as Christians for us to always be about doing good and not doing those other things. Johnny, you got some comment?
I think it's interesting that he gives us a couple of adjectives in the first part of this, and then he says, go out and do good works. And then he gives us a bunch more adjectives after it. So he's couching these activities all around doing it the right way, kind of what you were saying. And again, as a reminder, the diversity of this audience, this is where Tiberius sent a lot of his dissidents. This was very much a mixing pot, a melting pot of a variety of attitudes, both political and ethnicity. And so to try to appeal to all of these folks on the basis of good behavior with these narratives that kind of surround it, just incredible if you stop and try to analyze that part. It's not by accident. All this is so well put together.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I would throw out there, we all know the scripture. How will they know Christians? They will know us by our love, right? That means, that fundamentally, that means they're going to know us by the way we behave, the way we act. Because love is not something that you hear in words. It is something you see in actions. And that harkens back to what you've been hammering today, Johnny, that this is about doing, right? This is about acting. This is about, we can't just passively say we're good people. We have to demonstrate that we are out doing good things, and our actions will speak for themselves. And we can crow all we want, about being something, but people are going to know us by the things that we do. And if we're not doing anything, they're going to know that. And if we're doing bad things, they're going to know that. And if we're doing good things, they're going to know that. And I just think as Christians, it's, we're constantly being reminded to be out there doing the good. And go ahead.
From a community college level through doctoral programs as a teacher and trainer, one of the things that was universally true from the 18-year-olds to the 88-year-olds, 78-year-olds we had, was not when they were impressed with a teacher, it was not that they knew their stuff better than anybody. It was that they could interact with a reflection of knowledge, but concern and respect and well-being for the parties they were trying to serve. They didn't really care too much about the academic prowess until they knew that you had a heart for them. And I just think it's a great reminder. You talked about some other professions that's the same way. Practicing this, some religions use the term practicing fill in the blank. I think practicing means demonstrating and showing whatever label you want to put with it. The key there is doing it the right way. and we've got the guidelines. We got the job description.
You know, one of my best friends in the world is this guy named Steve Sanders. He lives in Stillwater, Oklahoma. He grew up in Ninnekah, Oklahoma. God blessed him with this amazing voice, and he became an opera singer. Traveled all over the United States, all over the world, singing as an opera singer from Ninnekah, Oklahoma. And now he's a college professor. But I got to see him this last week. And one of the things that I always admired about him was he had this heart that he was always doing good. And, you know, I was like, I wonder, it didn't take but a few moments. We went to visit him at his house, and I get a phone call. He gets a phone call, and it's the preacher there in Stillwater asking him to help with this family that needed some stuff, and had to do with a garden they plant there. And I, you know, immediately I was like, okay, this is Steve, because this is what Steve does. He helps people. And then it wasn't, I was there like 45 more minutes, and all of a sudden there was a second call, and it was from one of his students that he's a college professor and that he teaches, one of his vocal students who was calling to say, hey, I need to do some work on my car. Can I bring it by your place? And he was going to use Steve's stuff. Steve had stuff to work on a car, and Steve was going to help him work on his car. And there was no question that that's what Steve was going to do. There are certain people in this world that, you know, when you have a need, are going to help you. And we should all be those people. But I promise you, Steve Sanders is one of those people. People go to him for help in all situations. And I can't tell you how many times I've prayed that God makes me like Steve Sanders, because I want people to know they can come to me for help, and I'll follow through on, and I will see them helped. And I want to be Steve Sanders. And I think that he's one of these people that models that behavior, that he's always ready to do whatever is good in those situations. Now, I will tell you, he's not a deep doctrinal guy. He's not a guy who you're going to get a lot of philosophizing from regarding the theological stances on various things. He's just somebody out there doing good. He is that pure religion, taking care of widows and orphans. That's Steve Sanders. And I think we all ought to be a little more Steve Sanders. Okay. The next one is remind the people to slander no one. Man, again, if you spend much time on social media, this is something we struggle with in a lot of ways. But I think at its heart, it's reminding us that as Christians, we're not in the business of tearing people down. We're not here to character assassinate people. Instead, I actually think we're here to build people up. We're here to encourage people. And Paul's just trying to remind Titus, to remind these people, don't go about tearing people down. That shouldn't be your focal point. Any comments, guys?
You know, I always believe that you criticize in private and you praise in public. And if you don't have something good to say, you can always keep your mouth shut.
Yep. Don't we teach our children, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all? I agree with you. I think there are times that people in leadership have to deal with hard truths, and you have to deal with hard situations. But I think generally our attitude should always be that we're here to build each other up and not to tear each other down.
Now, y'all are the scholars, not me, but I believe that there is some guidelines. If you have a quarrel with a neighbor or a brother, you go do it this way. You bring somebody, you go do it this way. You take them before the church at like step 3 or something. So there's a conflict resolution process that's in place for us to follow. I don't know how you improve on that.
I'm not a highly trained Bible scholar, but I have read Titus chapter 3 prior to today. And Titus chapter 3 verse 10 says, warn a divisive person once and then warn them a second time. After that, have nothing to do with it. You got Corinth, you have First Corinthians where it talks about the sexually immoral brother and turning them over to Satan. There is example after example of how to deal with those situations. Absolutely. And keep in mind, each of those situations, it's about the salvation of the person you're dealing with. It's not about tearing them down. It's actually about building them up through the actions that you're taking.
Right. That's the Matthew 18 example that Paul's laying out. Mine in New American Standard Bible, it says to malign no one.
Yeah.
To be peaceable, gentle, showing every consideration for all men. So what did yours say, Jason? Slander? Did it say
Slander.
Which version are you in?
I am in the NIV right now.
Okay.
Mine says speak no evil. It's the American Patriot one. So they're getting to the same place, I think.
Yeah, King James says to speak evil of no man. So yeah.
Yeah. And I think in all situations where it's basically, we're not in the business of beating people up. We're in the business of helping people. Paul?
Well, even if it's the truth, it's not good to did I say that? Type stuff. Because, it's other people will turn off to whatever you're trying to talk to them about or share with them because, you have maligned them or spoken evil of them. Even if it happens to be true in some cases, this is difficult stuff to do because, we always want to win the fight, right? We do. That's just our nature as human beings. Our flesh, as Paul says in Romans 7, does things that pleases itself, and hurting someone else is one of those fleshly things that the flesh wants to do. And so this is a spirit working in you. These things, these words are from the Spirit that Paul is writing for us. This is the Spirit talking. This is how you love God with everything you've got, heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. This is loving your neighbor as yourself. It's not easy. It's not easy to do.
And going along with what you were saying about it, not even if it's true, look, the slander has those connotations of it not being true. But when you go on with the rest of that verse, it says to be peaceable and considerate and always be gentle towards everyone. The mindset is even when there's hard truths to deal with, you don't deal with people harshly. And that's something that I think as Christians, we need to be mindful of. I remember a guy I grew up going to church with. He was in his 90s, former mayor of the town I grew up in. And he was a man all about the hard truths. And if you wanted to know a hard truth about yourself, go to him and he would share them with you. And a man who had been a very powerful tool for the Lord and had been very influential in our community, because he dwelled in those hard truths all the time, became somebody nobody listened to any longer. He became a crank that people weren't interested in hearing what he had to say. And he still had a lot of important things to say. He knew the Bible forward and backwards. And he had a lot of wisdom, but there were very few people that were willing to engage with him to get that wisdom because he lived in that hard truth all the time.
I think Paul uses the I think it's adverb or verbs that deal with peg, bleed, appeal, rather than order and force. He's getting to that on the basis of a different level. In raising horses, we call you ride with a gentle but firm hand. You do not allow, you correct improper behavior, but you don't punish it, and you simply reward positive behavior. And that seems to me pretty appropriate for at least some of us mule-headed people.
Yeah, and I think it's important that in the church we realize that our purpose is above us, and so it oftentimes we need to be acting with the best interest of others in mind as opposed to our own self-interest. And I think that will make us more general in the way we deal with people. Now, the next one is to be remind the people to be peaceable. What's interesting here is the Greek word is a macho, which is the opposite of macho. So remind people to be the opposite of macho would be another way to say that. It suggests to us that we're to be conciliatory and not divisive. Even though we may disagree, we shouldn't seek the conflict in that disagreement all the time. And so when we're called to be peaceable, the New American Standard, when it originally translated the word, used the word uncontentious. And that, at least with the commentators I read, they kind of favored that type of translation as opposed to peaceable. But under either scenario, the idea is we are not to be people who are creating divides in the church or divides in our community or divides in our relationships with each other.
And especially important because this was such a melting pot. This was a highly diverse group of people from very different backgrounds and previous religions. And so brute force and condemnation is probably not the way to accomplish that, because there already was, you want to be the opposite of the hostility that they were used to dealing with. That makes you stark difference.
Absolutely. And the next one is remind the people to be considerate. In this case, the Greek word that's used is to be considerate, but it also has this hint of forbearance, which is an old word, but that we don't use a lot today. You don't hear people say forbearance very often today. But what that means is you're not seeking recompense for every wrong that's done to you. You know, just because you have the right to gain a pound of flesh from your neighbor doesn't mean you take that right and employ it. You know, a word we use today a lot is the word gracious. And in its context, gracious has that root word of grace, right? So when we're being gracious, it means we're not seeking maybe what we're entitled to as far as recompense or justice, but we're willing to forbear it. We're willing to put it off for the benefit of somebody else. And that means what it is to be considerate. When we arrive at a checkout line simultaneously with someone else, the considerate person allows the other person to go first. Or you get to you're in a zipper situation when you're driving. You know what those are, right? Where two lanes are merging and the traffic's so slow. Instead of fighting that person that's trying to get over, you allow them in there. You're the gracious person. Even though you may be in the lane that has the right of way, you're the gracious person that allows them on. Or maybe it's the big rig that's broke down on the shoulder that's now trying to get back on the highway. You're the person that slows down and allows them to get on the highway. Those are some examples that I came up with in my head of how it is to be considerate.
You know, I've observed that sometimes when you defer to another person, using the traffic analogy again, that if you can watch them in this slow moving traffic, they will then in turn defer to somebody else. So I feel like that's a positive influence.
Well, it's the whole pay it forward mentality, right? You hear those chains where the people buy the meals of the person behind them, I guess, and they just keep that up. And you hear about chains that go on for hours now, where people do that. And I think it's a little gimmicky, but I also think it's beautiful that people are willing to do that. And lots of times it comes at a great cost, because I may have ordered a cup of coffee, but I'm buying 4 hamburgers for the guy behind me. Hey, Paul, go ahead.
No, I was just saying that, building on what you guys are saying, is that, people take notice of that, and even though they didn't initiate it, they want to be part of it. And you're demonstrating loving one another, and so that's consideration of other people, being meek. It doesn't mean that you're weak. It just means that you're considerate of people, and people notice it. People pay attention to it. You want to be different in a good way. That's one way to be different in a good way, and you're teaching. You're making a difference in someone's life, and so these are all very doable things if you make up your mind to doing it. If you want to be a bully, and you're not gonna do this stuff because you think it makes you look weak. What's the song? You think you're strong, but you're really weak. It's just one of those things where the flesh thinks one thing, the spirit thinks another altogether. This is what the spirit thinks. This is, the spirit's trying to get you in line with the will of God, because the spirit can only follow the will of God. It doesn't follow any other will. It follows the Father's will. And so if you're letting the Spirit lead you, then He's leading you in that direction. And these are some of the things that, as you see yourself doing this, you're realizing, again, like you would in Galatians, in the fruits of the Spirit. Oh, hey, I'm letting the Spirit work in me. I want to keep doing that.
Let me interrupt you real quick, Paul, because you
I'm
just
done.
hit on something that fills in with this very last one. Remind people to always be gentle towards everyone. Now, that's a word that's translated a lot of places gentleness, but it's also translated as meekness in a lot of places. But it's also the Greek word that's used to describe a horse's submissiveness to its master when it's been broken. Okay? Now, how, and this goes with something you just said, Paul, how as Christians can we view ourselves as the same as a trained horse, or the same as a horse that's been broken by its owner? How in the world can we as Christians be comparable to that? And it doesn't sound very macho. It doesn't sound very cool. It doesn't sound very strong. But as a Christian, how are we like a horse that has been trained to be rode?
I'll defer to the cowboy on the screen here.
Well, I was going to say, Johnny, half the time I hear all sorts of ranching and cowboy analogies from you. So this should be right up your alley.
You called on Paul. I was going to wait. We raised horses and trained horses for over 40 years, and I never broke a horse. I simply trained a horse, and some horses did not wish to be trained, and I wasn't going to abuse them. I just sent them down the road someplace else. But I think that this is really a great analogy. We started these verses by talking about being calm and gentle and obedient, and then we said do these things, and now we've got all these good attributes again. So they go hand in glove. It's like he enveloped around do good with all these attributes, and how it would be characteristic of doing it. Germans and horses are a whole lot alike. Sometimes you got to get their attention before they'll do what you want them to do. And I can say that with a name like Rosenauer pretty comfortably. But I just think these are great analogies. You got to make them want to do what they want to do, and you do that best by showing them, by demonstrating it in how you treat them and how you treat others, I think.
Well, and Paul, you've been in Romans a lot lately. There's really this idea that we'll either follow the spirit of the flesh or we'll follow the spirit of God, right? We will follow one of those two spirits. We're broke. We're tamed one way or the other, right? I mean, we're either a slave to the flesh or we're a slave to God. And we don't like using those analogies anymore, and we're uncomfortable with those descriptions. But really, we are, a horse that has learned to take the bit is a horse that can be used to work, is a horse that can be used to do ranching and cattle and running all that. I'm not a rancher, so whatever horses do. But as Christians, we're the same way. We can be most effective when we've given ourselves over completely to God and to the Spirit and letting it guide us in all that we do. Go ahead, Paul.
Well, you just said it. You're either going to be a slave to the Lord or you're going to be a slave to the devil. You pick. You pick. But you're going to be a slave to somebody. I don't care who you are. You're going to be a slave to somebody. So you get to choose who you're going to be a slave to. Satan uses everything he can against you. When Satan accuses you to God, he's telling God the truth about you. He can't lie to God. He tells God the truth about you. And he's right, because God already knows what your sins are. All God says is repent of them, accept my grace, move on. Let my Spirit fill you up. Let me convert you into who I want you to be. Because there's no conversion without the Spirit. Otherwise, you're back in the flesh. If you fight the Spirit, you're not going to be converted into God's will.
And that's a great preview for next week when we read those 3, 4, and 5, right? And 6 and 7, because that's all about the Spirit renewing, the rebirth, what Jesus Christ has brought to us. So that's a precursor to next week. I really appreciate everybody's comments this week. I am out of time. So I look forward to our final class next week. Thank you, everybody, for being here.